All right, let's go create some new virtual machines. Now with Azure, there's a plethora of ways that you can actually create virtual machines. Everything from the portal to PowerShell to the Azure client. You can use Visual Studio, you can use ARM templates, you can use browser-based tools like the Azure Quick Start deployments that are on GitHub. So there's really an endless number of options, but they all come down to really kind of doing the same basic set of tasks. We'll run through a few examples of ways we can create virtual machines, starting with the portal. With the portal, if I go to the marketplace, you can see I've got both a Windows Server VM and a Linux VM as kind of two default options. If I come here to compute, we can start seeing different kinds of virtual machines that are available. So for example, if I want a SQL Server virtual machine, I can type SQL, and we can actually find some virtual machine templates in there that are based on SQL Server. So here's a SQL Server data warehouse, an always-on cluster, SQL Server 2016 standard, and so on and so forth. So there's all sorts of virtual machines in the marketplace. We're going to go back and just do a simple Windows virtual machine. It doesn't really matter what the virtual machine is. The process is basically the same. So you've got this Windows virtual machine. In fact, let's open another copy of the portal over here. I'm going to slide this one here. I'm going to do a new window. I'm going to slide this one over here and go to the Azure portal. And we'll kind of side by side do a Linux virtual machine. So new Ubuntu Server VM. And so begin with a name. Call this one Linux, we'll call this one Windows. Disk types, admin username. For Linux, it's all lowercase. For Windows, it can be uppercase. And then a password. Now for Linux, we can do a password or we can do an SSH public key. I don't have one readily available, so we'll just use a password. Resource group, call this one Windows, we'll call this one Linux. And then the location. Click OK. With Windows, we got the option to say we already own a license. We're going to say no, so actually we'll say yes on this one. And what that will do is reduce the cost because we're using our on-prem licensing structure, typically something like a software assurance agreement, to cover the licensing. And rename that resource group. And we'll just say no, click OK. And so now we pick our size. And again, here we can choose any size that's valid. And you can do a couple of things to help. We can say, well, I want HDD based sizes or SSD. And then what's the minimum CPU? Say I need 4 CPUs. It'll adjust the display accordingly so that I only see options that have 4 CPUs available. And then we can show what's recommended, or we can view all, which will show us all the supported sizes that are available. And you'll see there's a lot more here. And you can choose the one that is most relevant for the workload that you're trying to deploy. So we'll do a D4SV3 for both of these VMs. We're now up to our storage network and other elements of our configuration. So we're going to use managed disks. We've got some demos and information in the VM storage section on what that means and why you would choose it or not choose it. So for now, we're going to take the recommended easy path of using a managed disk. We're not going to set an availability set. We're deploying one VM. An availability set containing one thing is sort of redundant. It doesn't do anything for us, so we don't need an availability set. We'll take the default networking. We don't need any extensions. We will enable auto shutdown because I don't want these VMs to be accidentally left on overnight. Actually, well, that's on by default. We'll leave it on, and we're going to set the shutdown time to use Eastern time at the end of my day, which is at 5. So far you can see that, with Linux and Windows, everything really is identical. We're going to disable boot diagnostics and click OK. Azure will now validate that everything we've just asked it to do is in fact valid, and we can proceed with the deployment. Now, One of the things that I can do at this stage is, let's say that I don't want to deploy the VM right now. Let's say that I want to deploy this VM a little bit later. It gives me the option to download the template for the virtual machine. So if I click on this, it's going to maximize this window. It produces all the automation that's required to deploy this VM using other methods. For example, here's an ARM template. And this is all the required code if I want to deploy this virtual machine using Azure Resource Manager as a template. Here's the client command script. So if I wanted to use the Azure Unified Client on Linux or on Mac, or even on Windows with a shell installed, here's the deployment that I would use. Here's the PowerShell to deploy this virtual machine. Here's the .NET code, and here's the Ruby code. So we'll go ahead and click Create on this. We'll close this template window, click Create, and we'll let both these two virtual machines go ahead and complete their deployment. Now this will take a couple of minutes, so I'm going to pause the live action here, and we'll just come back to it once these two deployments are completed and look at the ways that we can actually go connect to these VMs. And these VMs are now deployed. So in terms of connecting to the virtual machines, for the Windows virtual machine, it's very straightforward. You need a remote desktop client. Now you can use any valid remote desktop client. I'm on a Windows system, so the built-in RDP client works great. I can simply click Connect. It downloads the corresponding .rdp file, and I go ahead and log on. So we'll let that just churn in the background. For a Linux virtual machine, it doesn't actually deploy a desktop, so we need an SSH client. Now, if I remember correctly, I have installed on this particular system the Windows subsystem for Linux, or the Linux subsystem for Windows, I should say, and it has a built-in SSH client, so we can simply copy what they give us in the Connect button, go ahead and log on. I'm now on this Linux system. So that's the primary method I'm going to use to connect to those virtual machines. Now, obviously, both RDP and SSH are primarily for administrative purposes. If I were to go ahead and install applications, then those applications might require additional ports being opened or additional types of connections being allowed, but that's a topic for another video, another demo. For now, we're just looking at how we connect as an administrator to do basic admin tasks. You can actually connect to a Linux desktop using a graphical shell. Now, to do this, it does vary a little bit depending on the distribution of Linux, but for an Ubuntu Linux machine, there's a couple of shell commands that you can run. So these commands do take a couple of minutes, so we're going to run them, let them run, and then come back and actually perform the connection. The first one is to do an update. And so this will run and update all the packages that are inside this system. And this one takes a little bit. There it's gone. Now we're going to install some application packages that support RDP. And so this one takes a little bit, so we'll let this run. And once it's finished, install the RDP package. Okay, so that rather lengthy command is run. That previous command actually installs the desktop environment, which is not installed by default in a Linux system. And then our next one is our RDP client. So this one's quite a bit shorter. It doesn't take that long to install. And then we've got to do a couple of simple configuration options. Couple of simple configuration commands to get RDP configured and then to start properly. So here we're starting the RDP service, and now we're almost ready. The last thing we've got to do is come over to our Linux virtual machine and just open up our RDP port. So here we go to the networking section, and we're just going to add a new inbound rule for RDP. So this is just going to be a custom rule, and we're going to choose RDP, and we're going to allow RDP. And that's it. Once this rule is created, we're now able to RDP to our Linux virtual machine. So there's the rule. And just grab the public IP address of the Linux virtual machine right here. Click connect. And we should now be able to log on. Go ahead and connect with our credentials. And we're now on the desktop of our Linux virtual machine. So there you have it, some real simple, easy ways to create both Linux and Windows virtual machines, and then also the different ways that you can actually go about connecting to those virtual machines, both through consoles and also through RDP.